Imagine living in a place where the rules kept changing, but you had no say in what those rules were. That's exactly what happened in Canada during the 1700s. Wars, treaties, and government decisions kept shifting who was in charge and how land was divided. For Indigenous nations, French and British settlers, and newly arrived Loyalists, these changes brought both opportunities and struggles. Some laws protected people, while others took away rights or ignored them completely. Let's take a look at some of the most important political and legal changes of this time and how they shaped the future of Canada. One of the biggest changes happened in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. This treaty was signed in Europe to end a war between Britain and France, but it had major effects in North America. France lost Acadia, now Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay to Britain. The British were now in charge of these areas, but the people who already lived there, Acadians and Indigenous nations, weren't included in the discussions. The British let the Acadians stay at first, but over time they saw them as a threat. This would later lead to the expulsion of the Acadians in 1755, when thousands of Acadians were forced from their homes. Meanwhile, Indigenous nations, who had lived on these lands for thousands of years, found their territories being taken over by European powers, who acted like they had the right to divide the land among themselves. After the British defeated the French in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, they had to figure out how to manage their new territory. This led to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, one of the most important laws in Canadian history. The proclamation did two major things. First, it officially recognized Indigenous land rights, stating that settlers couldn't just take land from First Nations without signing treaties. Second, it set up a system for governing the new British territories, including Quebec. While this sounded good on paper, in reality, British settlers often ignored the law and continued expanding onto Indigenous land, causing conflicts that would last for generations. A decade later, Britain needed to figure out how to govern the French-speaking population in Quebec, who were now living under British rule. Instead of trying to force them to become British, the government made a surprising decision: the Quebec Act of 1774. This law allowed French Canadians to keep their language, Catholic religion, and legal system. The British hoped this would keep the French population loyal to Britain, especially since the American Revolution was happening just south of the border. But not everyone was happy. Many British settlers in Quebec were angry because they wanted British laws and Protestant traditions to take over. At the same time, Indigenous nations were left out of the discussions, even though the land they lived on was now officially controlled by Britain. Then came the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, when the 13 American colonies fought for independence from Britain. When the revolution ended, thousands of Loyalists, people who stayed loyal to Britain, fled to Canada. To make room for them, the British needed to create a more structured government, leading to the Constitutional Act of 1791. This law split Canada into Upper Canada, mostly English-speaking settlers, later Ontario, and Lower Canada, mostly French-speaking settlers, later Quebec. Each section got its own government, but democracy was limited. Real power still belonged to British-appointed officials. While these changes helped organize Canada's government, they didn't include everyone. Indigenous nations weren't given a voice, even though their land was being divided up. Black Loyalists, who had been promised freedom and land for supporting the British, often got the worst plots of land or were ignored completely. Women and most working-class people also had no say in government decisions. These political and legal changes shaped Canada's future. The Treaty of Utrecht and the Royal Proclamation shifted land ownership but didn't respect Indigenous rights. The Quebec Act helped French Canadians keep their culture, but frustrated British settlers. The Constitutional Act set up a new government, but it mostly benefited English and French settlers, while leaving many others out of the decision-making process. This period laid the groundwork for the tensions, struggles, and negotiations that would continue for centuries.